You think power is loud. You think it announces itself with banners, speeches, and dramatic declarations. But real power doesn't beg for attention. It calculates your panic, then it uses your panic as fuel. In 2022, the world watched a financial system get attacked like a body on an operating table. And what shocked everyone wasn't the violence of the attack. It was the calm. It was the preparation that had been quietly built for years, so that when the moment came, the country didn't collapse. It adapted faster than the attackers could finish rehearsing their victory speech. Welcome to the hidden self. This is where we stop pretending that the stories you tell yourself about control are true, because whether you admit it or not, you live inside an invisible battlefield too, and you are often losing not because you are weak, but because you are unprepared to face what your mind does under pressure. Let's talk about what happened when the financial chokehold was tightened and why the most important battle wasn't financial at all. It was psychological. It was about who could keep the story straight while everyone else was already writing their own obituary. When people hear sanctions, they imagine paperwork and headlines. They imagine money gets frozen, accounts get blocked, the end. But the kind of sanction that rattled Russia in 2022 wasn't just a door closing, it was a nerve being severed. Imagine the global financial system like a central nervous system, wires connecting every bank, every settlement, every cross-border trade. If you cut the main wire, you don't just stop the phone call, you stop the body from functioning. Payments fail, money can't move, transactions stall. And the public, because the public is trained to panic on cue, starts behaving like the end is already here. In the first hour, when the world expected chaos, the real magic wasn't a speech. It was an immediate refusal to cooperate with panic. The central bank governor, Elvira Nabiullina, didn't mourn. She didn't bargain. She didn't try to soothe everyone with comforting language like everything will be fine. She did something far more terrifying to investors. She treated fear like a mechanism. Fear is not a feeling in these moments. Fear is an instruction. When traders believe the currency is dying, they sell everything that might lose value. They chase safety by dumping local assets and grabbing dollars like survival is a market order. That behavior doesn't merely reflect fear, it produces fear. It accelerates the collapse because selling creates the falling. So she forced the brain of the market to change its behavior. One of the first moves was raising interest rates sharply from around 9.5% to 20%. On paper, that sounds like a financial textbook decision. In reality, it's an electric shock administered to the part of the economy that's about to spiral. Let's make it human. Think of a car going downhill without brakes. People see the slope, they see the speed, their instincts scream for action, but there's nothing to grab onto. When interest rates jump hard, it's like slamming the brakes so fast that the skid suddenly matters again. Suddenly, holding the currency isn't pointless. Holding the currency becomes worth something, because interest rates are the price of money. When the price jumps high enough, selling stops being a desperate impulse and starts being a calculation. You don't just lose value by holding. You gain a return by holding. And if return is real, then the frantic stampede has to slow down. But the goal wasn't stimulate growth. It wasn't optimism therapy. The goal was to freeze the risk and stop the bleeding long enough to build a bridge. Sometimes you don't fix the whole war in one day, you stop the bleeding first. That first day, she also closed the stock market. People think market closures are violent. In a crowd panic, the exits are dangerous. When people believe the floor is collapsing, they behave like gravity is the enemy. They run, they shove, they trample. Closing the market isn't about punishing anyone, it's about stopping the crowd from turning panic into physical damage. The Western narrative expected that panic would spread uncontrollably, that assets would evaporate, that prices would fall because everyone would act simultaneously. But by shutting down trading, she isolated the fire from the rest of the building. The market couldn't continuously transmit panic from one brain to another. And then came something even colder: capital controls and restrictions designed to prevent an outflow of foreign currency. Think of a reservoir filling with water. If you know the reservoir has a leak, you can't just comfort the people who are holding buckets. You plug the leak. Because if money can be converted and sent out, then every individual fear becomes a national drain. Nabiullina sealed pathways that panic would use like escape routes, because the attackers counted on one thing: that the public would behave like the worst version of itself under stress. When you give people a choice during fear, many of them choose the action that guarantees short-term relief even if it destroys long-term survival. If you've ever watched yourself do the same thing in your own life, you already understand this. You don't do it because you're dumb. You do it because your nervous system is trying to protect you from the feeling of loss. It's not morality. It's reflex. Now here's where the story turns from defensive to offensive, and this is where you should pay attention. In psychological warfare, being defensive is not passive if you choose it correctly. You can defend in a way that steals tempo. You can defend in a way that makes your opponent miscalculate. Once the initial panic was slowed and contained, the next phase was about converting the currency's meaning. A currency is not just paper or a number. It is belief. It is expectation. It is the story people tell when they decide whether the currency will hold value tomorrow. If belief collapses, the currency collapses. If belief holds, the currency breathes. But the attackers were counting on belief to collapse quickly because they were removing the usual supports. The problem for them was that Nabiullina didn't let the currency remain purely a belief object. She anchored it to something physical and essential, energy and commodities. This is where the micro story matters. There was a requirement placed on major exporters, primarily those dealing in energy and raw materials. They were ordered to sell a large portion of their foreign currency earnings, around 80%, and convert it into rubles. Imagine a country whose main resource exports are paid in dollars. Companies receive dollars. Those dollars get stored, transferred, and potentially used to weaken the local currency. So instead of letting the dollars sit like a private hoard, Nabiullina forced them to pour into the domestic system and support the local currency. Supply and demand are not metaphors in these moments. When dollars flood the wrong market, the dollar becomes cheaper and the ruble becomes weaker. When dollars are converted and rubles must be bought to operate, demand for rubles rises. This is financial engineering that feels almost like alchemy, but it's not magic. It's coercing behavior to create a new equilibrium. It uses the country's own production engine as a demand engine. And then came the most disruptive move for the attacker's worldview. Payment for Russian energy was shifted in a way that required buyers to engage with rubles. In plain terms, if you want the blood of the European economy, you don't get to pay with the currency that you control. You have to pay with the currency that Russia controls. That forces a new kind of dependency. You don't just get to exploit sanctions logic anymore. You have to participate in the alternative payment structure. You have to buy rubles. You have to support rubles. You have to do work for the system you thought you were suffocating. It changes the currency from a fragile confidence token into a purchase ticket for something indispensable. A currency backed by belief can be defeated by rumor. A currency backed by energy cannot be dismissed so easily because the demand is not optional if survival and industry require it. Now, most people watching this are only impressed by the technical details, but the real psychological lesson is deeper. When you reorganize the incentives, you reorganize the mind. You stop people from being able to justify panic. You remove the narrative that makes panic seem rational. In a sense, Nabiullina wasn't just managing money, she was managing cognition at the national scale. And then, after about a day, the story moved into infrastructure. Western sanctions often assume that once you cut the visible lines, the invisible roots don't exist. They assumed the nerve was gone permanently, but Nabiullina anticipated that. She prepared a domestic alternative payment system, SPFS, described as an internal version of the global messaging infrastructure. SWIFT was the common language used to communicate between banks internationally. If you remove it, you don't just slow trade, you create uncertainty and paralysis. SPFS, however, had already been built, not in response to the crisis. Years earlier, this was preparation as a doctrine. The country didn't have to invent an emergency system during the emergency. It already had an escape ladder installed in a place most attackers never thought to check. What does this mean psychologically? It means she refused to make her survival dependent on someone else's permission. She didn't build her plan on the opponent being clumsy. She built her plan on the opponent being competent. And that's the mistake so many ordinary people make. They survive by hope. They survive by assuming that other people will be fair, that systems will be stable, that luck will hold, that the future will continue behaving like the past. Then something unpredictable happens, and suddenly they realize they don't have an emergency option for their identity, their finances, their relationships, or their mental health. When you don't have a contingency, every shock becomes existential. You start thinking in catastrophes because you don't have a protocol. Nabiullina's protocol worked because it was built in advance. Not only did the system for internal transactions keep moving, the crisis also intersected with payment cards used globally. When global platforms announced withdrawal, they threatened another layer of public panic. cash access, and everyday purchases. If you want to understand how fear spreads, watch how quickly people assume their normal life depends on fragile infrastructure they never learned to build. People don't realize what they rely on until it disappears, and when you remove it, behavior changes instantly. People hoard cash, people refuse to buy, commerce slows, the economy turns inward, so the alternative mattered. Russia relied on its domestic card system, Mir, and expanded reliance on partners like China's Union, pay for international needs. Again, it wasn't about ideology, it was about connectivity and routing. They didn't just survive the cut, they rerouted, they rebuilt the bridge while the enemy was still announcing it had destroyed the river. And then we reach another psychological layer, the war of appearances and timing. By around day 2, the infrastructure was stable enough that technical panic could no longer easily run away. But financial war doesn't only depend on systems, it depends on rumors, it depends on incomplete information, it depends on people filling gaps with imagination, and imagination is often worse than reality. This is where Nabiullina's public demeanor became part of the weapon system. She appeared calm on television, not because she was calm for her own comfort, but because calm is contagious when the public is looking for permission to stop panicking. When leadership performs stability, it tells everyone implicitly that someone has control, and the market hates uncertainty more than it hates bad news. She didn't overload people with complicated explanations. Her message was simple: the system has liquidity, trading continues, nothing collapses today. Now, here's the part most people won't want to hear, because it sounds unpleasant. Alongside reassuring the public, she stopped publishing some crucial macroeconomic data, especially reserves and money flow related indicators. This is the strategic fog. In normal life, people think transparency is always moral. They think secrecy automatically means corruption. But in crisis warfare, transparency can also be tactical surrender. If the enemy can see exactly how much you have left, they can calculate how long you will last. They can set an attack schedule based on your depletion timeline. So hiding data can be a form of protection. It denies the opponent a clear target and forces them to attack with less precision. In poker terms, you keep a straight face while your opponent guesses at your hand's strength. The opponent wants certainty. Uncertainty is your leverage. That doesn't mean lying for convenience. It means controlling what information becomes ammunition. And if you've ever had a moment in your own life where you told people everything's fine while quietly drowning, you already know the emotional version of this. Some people learn to manage perception because they can't afford to let others determine their limits. But there's a difference between shame-driven hiding and strategy-driven discretion. One destroys you from inside, the other preserves you long enough to build the next move. Nabiullina's approach made the Western assumption of rapid collapse harder to sustain. The longer the attack failed to produce collapse, the more expensive the attacker's narrative became. If your plan depends on public belief breaking, then every day of stability drains the attacker's confidence in their own story. Then comes the final 72-hour clock. The world held its breath, expecting a timed explosion, but the bomb never went off. After 3 days, the measures didn't just stop the fall, they started reshaping the currency's behavior. The ruble stopped bleeding. It began to stabilize. It strengthened over subsequent weeks, and in 2022 became one of the strongest currencies globally. From the perspective of standard economic theory, this is the part people struggle to understand. Sanctions were supposed to be decisive. The logic was supposed to be mechanical, but this wasn't mechanical. It was engineered. Preparation met crisis, and crisis didn't get to choose the pace. If you want to understand the deeper mechanism, it's this: sanctions create pressure, but they cannot directly control every variable in a living system. A living system can adapt if it has infrastructure, policy tools, and leadership discipline ready before the pressure arrives. In other words, the outcome wasn't luck, it was architecture. Nabiullina had been building reserves, reducing dependence on dollar holdings, shifting toward gold, and lowering external debt risk. Low debt is not just a financial metric, it is psychological freedom. When a country has fewer obligations tied to hostile lenders, it is less forced into panic decisions, and gold as an asset has different constraints than balances stored in systems controlled by others. The point is not that gold is magical, the point is that certain assets have fewer choke points. If you're trying to connect this back to the hidden self, here's the painful truth. Most people don't fail because they lack intelligence. They fail because they lack structural readiness. They live with one emotional bank account: hope. When pressure hits, they withdraw without deposits. Then they call the overdraft fate. In love, people do this constantly. They build their relationship on belief instead of behavior. They assume commitment equals safety. They assume good intentions will protect them from instability. Then when conflict comes, they don't know how to stabilize the system because they never built routines, boundaries, agreements, and accountability mechanisms. They react like gamblers. They chase certainty after the uncertainty has already caused damage. In money, the same pattern appears. People keep themselves vulnerable because they refuse to set up contingencies. One job loss becomes a collapse because there's no emergency fund. One unexpected expense becomes trauma because there's no buffer. Then they start asking for help in a panic, and panic makes them easier to manipulate. This is why the leadership lesson